Hello, everybody. I think we can get started now. If you're new to our webinar series, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. If you've joined us previously this year, we've had a whole suite of IVDR-related webinars, so thank you for being here again with us. Today's webinar topic is State-of-the-Art, Establishing a Solid Foundation for Your PERs to Encourage IVDR Readiness. Our presenter today is Principal Medical Writer, Dr. Sarah Chavez with Criterion Edge. Sarah has a bachelor's in biochemistry and a PhD in molecular and cellular biology with 25 years of laboratory bench experience and has taught at the university level for the past 15 years. She has extensive scientific writing experience in an academic environment as well as for several large textbook publishers. Sarah's strong background in basic research and her extensive experience with regulatory writing will allow her to assist companies with IVDR readiness as a part of the Criterion Edge team. Well, without further ado, let's get started. Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. So in today's webinar, I will be providing an overview of the state-of-the-art section, which we commonly refer to as the SOA. Before you begin writing your SOA, a readiness assessment or a gap analysis can help you identify those critical resources or feeder documents and really the expertise needed to establish that your IVD may be considered state-of-the-art. Ultimately, knowing what the notified body expects to see will help you avoid project delays and discover ways to make the SOA development process itself more efficient. With that in mind, I will start by discussing the purpose of the SOA and then describe our typical approach to SOA planning, writing, and documentation based on our experience with MDR. So really, the goals of the presentation are threefold. First, we really hope to drive home the importance of planning and preparation before you even begin to write your SOA. Next, we will outline the SOA literature review and assessment process to illustrate what we mean by documentation and to help you understand what the notified body is expecting to see. And third, we will explain the potential impact to the SOA and really your PER as a whole if these documents or processes are not available or in some way deemed inadequate or incomplete. So why do you need a state-of-the-art section? To answer this question, we should first take a moment to define what we actually mean by state-of-the-art. When we describe something as being state-of-the-art, we're typically using that terminology to convey that something is cutting edge or really the best of the best. Based on our experience with MDR, the MedDev Rev 4 is really the best source for guidance on the methodology and the required content for the SOA section. Manufacturers are expected to demonstrate a thorough clinical evaluation of the IVD in the context of what is generally acknowledged to reflect the most current best practice science. So, to establish that your IVD is state-of-the-art, you must be able to show how it fits into the entire scientific landscape and explain the circumstances and the diagnostic scenarios by which this IVD can be considered state-of-the-art. Your IVD doesn't necessarily need to be the most technologically advanced kit on the market, but you are expected to be able to show how it fits into the landscape of all similar IVDs in order to show that your IVD performs as intended and therefore meets its intended purpose. So that's where we'll start today. Why do we need the state-of-the-art? The goal of your PER is effectively to demonstrate scientific validity, analytical performance, and clinical performance of the IVD. But in reality, your PER is only as strong as its weakest part. If information is missing or if it's not well thought out or well connected, it will be nearly impossible to write an effective SOA, in large part because that SOA section has a direct impact on each component of the PER. Let's start with the risk-benefit analysis. The SOA will help you define and justify the criteria used in this analysis by providing background on what is generally considered to be acceptable risk and significant benefit. If the criteria change midway through the writing process or during an update, you'll need to go back and assess this in the SOA at update. So ask yourself, do you have this data? Has the IFU been finalized? Are product inserts available for you to review? You'll need all of those to inform your SOA writing. Next, the scientific validity report. The SVR must clearly present the scientific landscape by explaining the science behind the technology and what really constitutes state-of-the-art. The SOA should justify the acceptability of the analyte and the test based on the intended use. If other alternatives exist to test for different analytes to diagnose a particular pathology, the SOA should explain why your analyte is a valid scientific approach to diagnosing that medical condition. In addition, the SOA must also include an explanation of the criteria and the standards by which you established that your IVD is equivalent to all these alternatives or competitors, and some in large part will be determined by how your IVD is positioned within the IVD landscape as a whole. The analytical performance report. So this is where you will address the sensitivity and specificity of your IVD and explain the details of the protocols and the intended performance of your assay. This may include data obtained through an in-house validation experiment, as well as any reports on the IVD that have been published in the scientific literature. So the SOA is going to include a discussion of these data, and it will help you establish that your sensitivity and specificity are in line with alternative testing modalities. The clinical performance report. This is really one of the biggest changes and challenges in the transition from IVDD to IVDR. You will now be expected to document how your IVD performs in clinical settings. Up until now, you've always relied on in-house data, and now they want to see real-world experience. Well, the real world is actually this clinical data. The CPR will present clinical data identified through independent systematic literature review, which may include things like safety data in terms of risk of incorrect test results, as well as data on the performance of the IVD in that clinical setting. So knowledge of your patient population, indications, comparators, and outcomes, those are all necessary to conduct an unbiased assessment of safety and performance. The SOA will be how you describe the clinical relevance of your IVD, as well as the circumstances under which your IVD can be used in a clinical setting. If post-market surveillance identifies that your IVD is now being used in a different patient population, your PICO terms could change, and the SOA must incorporate these changes. So this is why it's so critical to go into the writing process with a clarity about the purpose of the IVD, the standards by which you will measure safety and performance, and the comparators and alternatives that will be used to define best practice within that scientific landscape. Writing the SOA will require an understanding of safety and performance objectives that are critical to the SVR, the scientific validity report, the APR, or the analytical performance report, and the CPR, the clinical performance report. So all three of these documents must support the position within the landscape and the equivalence criteria that you've selected. The SOA ensures that these three seemingly independent reports will feel like complementary pieces that they're intended to be, but the SOA is really where you set up the story that's needed to make that connection. Okay. So scoping is really the first step to writing your SOA. Existing feeder documents like your IFU could change during the lifespan of your IVD. And because science never stops, you should certainly anticipate that the SVR, APR, and CPR will also require updates as the scientific landscape inevitably changes. So this means that you will be expected to present a systematic and an organized process to continuously generate, collect, analyze, and assess the data that's pertinent to your IVD. The goal is really to develop this reproducible and an unbiased assessment of the safety and performance of your IVD in the landscape of diagnostic options and alternatives. So this is why having a well-organized template for your SOA is so critical. The central section of the SOA should present a comprehensive analysis of available therapies for the medical conditions that you're introducing. This section should include the therapy in which the IVD is used and acceptable alternatives. It should also objectively analyze and present the advantages and disadvantages of the various options and the acceptability of the benefit risk profiles. This section needs to be supported by the highest quality evidence available in the field, and the literature that you cite should be carefully appraised for its scientific validity. If available, data sources should include current guideline recommendations, which are released by medical associations, and also systematic literature reviews conducted to establish those recommendations. This section supports the choice of endpoints that are currently accepted and used in the medical field. The endpoint data cited here will be used as the reference against which IVD-specific data are compared in your PER. So data and performance of a benchmark and other IVDs that constitute the current therapeutic landscape can be incorporated here or in a subsequent subsection that informs on the maturity of available technologies. Technological information should include potential hazards associated with technologies and also the strategies employed to mitigate those risks. So as we've said, scoping is that critical first step to writing your SOA. The existing feeder documents, such as the IFU, SVR, APR, CPR, they'll all be also undergoing these routine updates. So developing a template that can grow and change during the lifespan of your IVD will save you a lot of time and resources and headaches long-term. These updates can become overwhelming, and if your template is not well thought out from the start, it can quickly begin to look a little bit like a Frankenstein SOA. You may get lucky and perhaps the clinical background hasn't changed much. However, based on our experience with CERs, this is typically not the case. Advances in our scientific knowledge can and will be reflected in the description of a medical condition. New types or causes may be identified, or we may have a better understanding of those causes and the progression of the condition. And clearly, the epidemiology should be updated to ensure that you're using the most current, recent available statistics. In addition, guidelines will be published regularly and should be reviewed to be included in your discussion of the current accepted role of your IVD in the clinical and scientific landscape. So you'll think about questions like, have the diagnostic criteria changed? Are newer tests or biomarkers available? Have other alternatives become obsolete or even removed from current recommendations? And have new risks or benefits been identified? This will all need to be reflected not only in your SOA, but also in your benefits and your risk analysis. And finally, as your competitive landscape evolves and changes, your competitor IVDs or alternative testing methodologies could also change. To illustrate that point, I'd like to use a typical scenario with a fairly familiar IVD. So suppose your company is one of the many that's developing a new COVID-19 test. In this example, the clinical background would be fairly straightforward. You would want to introduce the typical pathophysiology of COVID-19 infection and describe the clinical course. You may want to mention the cause as being the coronavirus, and then include a discussion of any of the new variant forms. You could describe the epidemiology, and that would include information about infections and the demographics of patients. And you'd also want to include potential clinical outcomes related to COVID-19 infection, both acutely and long-term. So in your description of the current accepted role of interventions, this is where you would introduce concepts related to the sensitivity and specificity, as well as the various technologies and samples. So in this example, the analytical specificity of a molecular COVID-19 test is its ability to determine exclusively the analyte it's intending to measure in the presence of many off-target templates or interfering substances, but it's doing so under well-controlled laboratory conditions. The analytical sensitivity of an assay often describes the lowest amount of an analyte that can be accurately measured through an assay. So ultimately, adequate analytical specificity and sensitivity will lead to optimal clinical performance. So for a molecular COVID-19 test, the quality and relative abundance of RNA in a collected sample is heavily dependent on the type and the site of collection. The abundance is also critical for the sensitivity of the assays. So for instance, the rate of RT-PCR detection of SARS-CoV-2 in patients with COVID-19 can be as high as 93% if you're testing in bronchoalveolar lavage fluid, but that rate drops to 72% in sputum, 63% in nasopharyngeal swabs, 32% in pharyngeal swabs, and only 29% in stool samples. So that's partly why that clinical performance is so relevant. Your APR will reflect the test accuracy in a controlled setting, but the clinical performance under a variety of different testing scenarios is critical to be reflected as part of your SOA. So as we all know, there are multiple approaches to COVID-19 tests, which can all be considered as available options or competitors. Some can be administered to detect an active infection. Some can provide information about prior exposure. Some are administered at home. Some are in the field. Some could be conducted in a clinical setting. So affordability, sensitivity, specificity, user-friendliness, time to results, reliability, the required equipment or reagents, all of these speak as to whether or not your test may be considered state-of-the-art. If you have an antigen-based test, it may not be able to detect an active infection. But I don't think anyone would argue that it doesn't still serve an important purpose in the clinical landscape. Your SOA must be prepared to explain the technology, including potential advantages and disadvantages, through a detailed and unbiased discussion of the literature you've obtained through your methodologically sound systematic literature review process. And I believe there was a question that popped up in the chat about the typical course. This comes up many times when we're discussing the medical background. In some cases, you may identify that a particular patient may be symptomatic. Sometimes you're now detecting that there are asymptomatic carriers. It may be that in your particular pathology that your IVD is designed to test for, that you may identify sort of an atypical patient. That would want to be included as you're updating your SOA, and that would be part of that systematic literature review. It would pull in information about that. Okay, so next slide. So that brings us to the next step, the SOA process itself. So suppose you're feeling very confident that you know what the SOA is and you know what it's supposed to accomplish. So you feel like you're ready to get started. What's your first step? In our experience, we want to begin with a clear understanding of the expectations of the notified body and also know what our required deliverables are. What do they want to see and how do they want to see it? Are you familiar with the guidelines and the expectations of IVD? So when setting up to develop a new state-of-the-art section, there really is no one-size-fits-all recipe, but a general process can be broadly grouped into these two stages, the planning and the writing. Most experienced SOA writers will tell you that having a really solid approach to the scoping, searching, and documenting is absolutely critical. Spending time in that planning phase will ensure that your SOA and really the PER as a whole wind up being cohesive and well-organized and scientifically comprehensive. And we've been discussing the importance of scoping. So this is where you begin to identify the types of data that you need. But are you in a position to actually identify all of those aspects right now? Is your regulatory strategy finalized? Have decisions been made with respect to the groupings of IVDs or the families within one PER? This is a really important decision to make early on, given that it will impact the SOA and the conditions, populations, and alternatives that you'll need to include in your discussion. But it could also impact the SVR, APR, and CPR potentially. So the next step then is searching. This is a critical step and it's often overlooked or undervalued. In a previous webinar, Criterion Edge has gone into quite a bit of detail about the systematic review process itself. So I really encourage you to take a listen to that recording on our website if this is an area that you're interested in. I won't be spending a ton of time on this particular step today, but I will say that it's one of the most important things to keep in mind is that this is just not a simple PubMed search, nor is it relying on a list of publications that you already know about and have saved in a file folder somewhere. IVDR requires methodology. It requires a sound systematic literature review process. And a well-crafted search strategy will save you hundreds of hours spent screening all of these off-topic hits that you would expect to see if you rush this step. Which brings us to the next step, which is documentation. This is where you're going to describe your approach to literature selection and also the strategies employed to ensure an unbiased assessment of each of these references. So the writing process itself doesn't actually begin until after these critical planning steps have been completed, and those results have been reviewed by multiple members of the writing team. From our experience with MDR, the notified body expects to see a very well described and a well documented process for this SOA search. Transparency and reproducibility are critical components of that screening process. So be prepared to document your screening decisions in order to comply with the new global regulatory standards that are outlined in MedDev Rev 4. As part of your screening, a complete list of all excluded references and the reason for exclusion are common and expected as reporting requirements. I'm sure it won't surprise everyone that the volume of literature that you're going to be expected to screen can be huge. Using the COVID testing example again, a simple search in PubMed of COVID testing retrieves well over 17,000 articles, and these have all been published in just the last 18 months. So clearly this approach would benefit from a much more targeted search strategy. However, one strategy to manage this challenge and make it more efficient is to use a multi-stage screening process, where the first level of screening includes a quick review of the title and the abstract to identify those that more straightforward screening decisions, such as, is the article in a foreign language? Is it technical data only? Is it a case report? Is it not related to the research question at hand? Some may be completely off target hits that get pulled in through your search terminology. The first level of screening saves time by identifying those obvious includes and cutting out those obvious excludes. Those references that are left in that maybe pile will require a full text article in order to review and determine your final screening decision. Now, the data extraction should also be prospectively planned and consistent. For the SVR, you would extract those PICO data that serve to inform your scientific review, the population, indications, comparators, and outcomes. Another critical element of data extraction is clearly identifying the relevant performance and efficacy outcome data, as you would extract those data for use in the CPR. So developing templates for data extraction is well advised, and it will also help to avoid human error, which often arises if you have a manual process for this. Using a data collection form or template that you've developed can ultimately result in much cleaner data and far greater efficiency. Reporting typically involves the PRISMA reporting structure, which is a very clear systematic flow diagram, and it will document each step of this entire review process. The documentation requirements may vary depending on where your report will be submitted, but these PRISMA flowcharts are typically included as part of your documentation to the regulatory authorities and major journals. If you use a screening software platform such as Distiller, creating a PRISMA flowchart is automatic and relatively easy. So as a basic rule of thumb, your documentation should be sufficiently detailed to support full replication. Transparent reporting and a strategy to organize and present your process is an absolute must. So that's where we'd like to end the presentation, is with a few questions really for you to think about as you're beginning to prepare your SOA. Do you have the templates for each of these documents? And if you do, how confident are you that they're IVDR compliant? Are you relatively certain that they'll pass the test if they're actually subjected to a notified body review? Do you have experience with systematic literature review? And again, I really encourage you to check out our previous webinar on that very topic. The PER is going to require multiple systematic literature reviews of clinical and scientific literature. And in addition to that, it will require the process of screening and appraising the literature, and that can be extremely daunting. With that COVID-19 testing example, if you wind up with 17,000 articles to screen by eye, how many people, how much time is that going to take you? Do you know how to refine that search terminology to cut that list back to a more manageable or targeted number? This is where an experienced reference librarian is really a critical asset to this process. And last, but certainly not least, the who. Do you have enough people on your team to do the job of compiling all of these documents and performing all of these searches, and then screening and selecting the articles, extracting that data, writing it up, reviewing it, and then QCing this final PER product, which will wind up being hundreds of pages long. So the presentation today is focused specifically on the SOA, but now's the time to really make sure that you have all of these moving pieces in place. So I'd like to end with a quote here and a figure that are both taken directly from MedDev Rev 4. This is really our best guide to the requirements for the SOA and for making your PER IVDR compliant. The main point for both of these is that the PER is a product, but it must represent your process. The SOA is your chance to tell the story of your IVD and to connect the dots between these supporting reports. This is where you're going to generate that cohesive, successful, and well-written PER. Partnerships are critical to the success of this task, particularly given the sheer monumental nature of assembling all of these parts together to form your PER. So be prepared to partner with your internal cross-functional colleagues across multiple departments. Form partnerships within your own team, and then partner with trusted external resources, such as your consultants or your vendors if needed. Your internal team, you are the subject matter experts on your IVD, and you likely already have many of these documents and data and information needed to begin to write these supporting documents, or at least develop a plan or an outline for these templates. Each person has their own specific role to play with their specialty, be it regulatory affairs, clinical affairs, quality, research and development, etc. But who among your team are the right people to be assigned the task of preparing and supporting and pushing along these reports, and ultimately the whole PER to completion? I typically use the analogy when I'm speaking to other basic scientists in the IVD world of writing a thesis. When you're writing a thesis, you're not just stapling together 3 or 4 papers that you publish during the course of your graduate work. You're trying to create a synthesis where you make connections between those different parts and different experiments. You're telling a full story, and that's where this SOA comes in. Its job is to be that link between these different parts, to show how the relevance and those connections can be made between the data, and to really set up the argument that your device is SOA. So this is the time to really honestly assess the resources that you have on hand and to start to identify those gaps and ways to fill those gaps now. Selecting the right people and putting them into the right roles, and then identify where existing gaps are. Whether it's time or people or resources or expertise, be proactive and begin to fill those gaps right now to ensure the success of your first draft of the PER.
Thank you, Sarah. We hope at this point you understand the purpose of the state of the art and its relationship to the FPR, APR, CPR, and PER, the inputs that have the greatest impact on the success of your PER, the state of the art process that the notified body expects to see, and how still evolving decisions and incomplete documents can negatively impact your PER quality and timelines. If not, please do continue to send us your questions. We've carved out some time just for your questions. And while your questions are coming in, I want to remind our attendees today that you can reach out to us after this webinar as well at consult@criterionedge.com to learn more about our services and to schedule some time to talk to our team. So Sarah, I'm going to be sharing our Q&A screen so you can see our first question here. Are you able to see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, so the first question is, are you treating your state-of-the-art as a separate document from the SVR or as a part of your SVR? Can the state-of-the-art search be combined with the scientific validity search? Please specify the differences and commonalities of the state-of-the-art and SVR. And I know we had this question multiple times in the registration as well, so hopefully this will clarify that for a bunch of people.
Yes, this is definitely a really common question and that we ourselves asked very early on in the process. I've actually put a couple of links in here in the chat box too, as some good supporting documents that may be helpful as far as really understanding the organization. In the actual IVDR regulations. If you look in Appendix 13, that's where it gives some basic outline as to where SOA and SVR are going to appear. The SOA is part of the PER, and the SVR will contribute to the PER. But the SVR, the Scientific Validity Report, is a standalone document. There will be significant amounts of overlap between the two, between these the data that you're retrieving from your SOA, because it's telling the story of the Scientific Validity Report. But the purpose of the writing is different. The SOA is designed to be more sort of more akin to like a specialized systematic review or a meta-analysis of your SVR, APR, and CPR. So really think of it more as sort of like this section, sort of a section within the PER. So typically what we recommend in the MDR world is to incorporate the state-of-the-art data into your PER and present it as a dedicated section. So that's sort of the approach that we're taking. The SOA should contain some of that the information that's pulled from the CPR, the SVR, and the APR, but it should be a standalone section in our opinion.
Thanks, Sarah. Next question up on the screen. Unlike under the MedDev MDR, is there actually a stipulation in the IVDR for the state-of-the-art to be systematic? I have only seen that searches for the SVR and CPR should be systematic, I believe. In my understanding, everything, it's implied that you should have a systematic literature review. In the MDR world, the SOA has its own independent systematic literature review. And so you can customize the search criteria that you're going to use in the search terminology based on whether or not you're identifying clinical literature or SOA related literature. You're going to want to pull in a lot of data that's relevant to other meta-analyses or clinical guidelines, that sort of thing. So the SOA should still have that very reproducible, methodologically sound approach to it. You should plan to, whenever you are pulling a new reference into your document, you should be able to explain and define where that document came from and why you're incorporating it. Did it meet your inclusion and exclusion criteria? All right. Our next question is, there is software available for systematic literature reviews. Are these accepted for use and widely adopted? Are there drawbacks of using the software?
I think it really sort of depends on your particular situation. I know for the most part, we employ a research librarian who's able to help us really customize our mesh search terminology to really get the most robust search returns. You know, if you can document the reason why you're using some of these different softwares and you're comfortable with some of the limitations of the softwares, what we've found in the past is that sometimes you identify that your particular first attempt at a systematic literature review was not actually retrieving the information that you really expected. If there are certain key articles that you would expect it to pull down and they're missing, that should be a warning sign that there's probably something wrong with the strategy that you're employing. So you definitely, I think it would be good advice, at least from our perspective, to still consult with a qualified reference librarian to really not underestimate this process. If the systematic literature review is not sound, it's going to make problems for the rest of the article and the writing process.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Next question is, what kind of competitor devices need to be discussed for the state-of-the-art CE IVD marked only?
So this, I think the current recommendations are stating that a comparable device needs to be considered with respect to any relevant aspects, whether it's technological or biological characteristics. So basically anything that would be used under the same circumstances to test for a particular clinical condition. So this will need you to have a solid understanding of the intended use, the clinical condition that's being treated, any sort of changes that could affect your ability to actually detect that condition, whether it's limitations associated with severity or staging of the disease, particular tissues that are being collected, user error, that sort of thing. So the competitor devices really need to reflect the reasonable alternatives that could also be derived in order to come to the same conclusions in terms of diagnoses. So in many instances, you may have direct competitors, like if you're with the COVID testing example, if you're doing a PCR-based approach, you can include other PCR-based, the RT-PCR-based COVID-19 tests. The other alternatives then would be the antigen testing or the antibody testing. So you can have both a combination of the competitors who are more akin, taking the same general approach that you're taking, but also include alternatives to that particular competitor. So I would think of it sort of like who's the most similar to you, who are your direct competition if you're trying to take a similar approach in terms of the analyte or the test that you're doing. But then are there alternatives in the field that should also be addressed?
Okay, thanks, Sarah. The next question, and I know we've had this one multiple times in the past as well. Does PubMed suffice as a database for literature search?
Yeah, this is we spent quite a bit of time on this on the SLR webinar that we did previously. The one caveat that I cannot emphasize this enough is that PubMed is going to only support the and search string syntax. It doesn't support or. So it's sort of an inherent, it's built into the way that this particular website is designed. So you wind up getting significantly more hits than if you were to use a platform such as ProQuest. And in addition, we use dialogue solutions, which can also search Embase at the same time it searches through PubMed and Medline. And that will include conference abstracts and also allow you to do the same search across multiple databases simultaneously. So you really don't have to go in and then go back in and search through different databases. So I would say if you're trying to take a PubMed only approach, be prepared to screen way more articles than you really intend to, and that you will be missing out on quite a bit that would be published in Embase or Medline based on your very precise search terminology. So you're definitely better off choosing a platform that can support more advanced search strings and then consulting with a reference librarian who can help you do those.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Our next question, how do you systematically search clinical guidelines?
This definitely comes up quite a bit. It can be a challenge. There are ways that you can tweak the mesh terminology to locate those guidelines, but in many cases, you actually will have to go in and do some ad hoc searching for appropriate organizations and sort of the usual organizations that you would expect to sort of oversee that area. So going in and finding sort of their individual websites and doing these ad hoc searches is appropriate in that respect. If in many cases we can identify several of the key pertinent guidelines through proper systematic literature review. But be prepared that once you review those articles, they may reference another organization's guidelines, and then you could pull that as sort of a secondary reference as part of this ad hoc searching. The main thing is just to document this process. So if you identify one organization's guidelines through your systematic literature review, you're consulting it, and then you identify several other guidelines that are referenced, you can go to them and still seek them out. But yeah, be prepared to sort of exhaust all efforts to identify any relevant clinical guidelines.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. The next question is, what is the best approach to developing relevant, I think this is safety and performance objectives, and why are they important to the systematic literature review?
So your safety and performance objectives, in many cases, you sort of go into that with a general knowledge, typically from as far as the IVDR world, most of the time you're thinking like more or less the performance, like how many times do I get false positives or false negatives? You very rarely consider sort of the safety in terms of like the risk to the patient for a false positive or a false negative. So that's really, I find that the SOA can do a pretty good job of giving you the lay of the land by finding and identifying those key guidelines and recommendations and those key systematic literature reviews and meta-analyses. By looking at those early on, you'll start to see these common safety and performance objectives that are fairly universally accepted across your particular testing realm. So like for instance, I used to do breast cancer research, and we had an antibody test that we developed to determine whether or not a patient would be a good candidate for a particular therapy. The safety and performance objectives would include information about how sensitive is our particular antibody in our assay? Does it only work if a woman is beyond a certain stage of breast cancer? Is it going to work in women with dense breasts or in women with other sorts of comorbidities? Does it work across all ages? Those are all things that would sort of fall into the safety and performance. And then you'd also want to discuss things like how a missed diagnosis, if your test is not sensitive enough to actually detect that particular biomarker when in reality a woman is positive, what risk or what is the safety outcome of that in terms of patient care? And the same with a false positive. What is the follow-up going to look like if your test is not as accurate as it should be and it has a high rate of false positives? In that case, what is the potential impact to the patient? So I think keeping in mind the safety and performance objectives are going to draw heavily from your APR and all of your performance in terms of how the test itself performs, but it also needs to be informed by that CPR, sort of what is the overall implication to the patient in terms of their clinical course.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Our next question is, since the state-of-the-art feeds into numerous documents, is it worth writing it as a standalone document and referencing rather than repeating the information?
Yes, when we write the SOA, it's a standalone document. It will refer to different appendices and to different other documents, but you should go into this treating the SVR, APR, and CPR, as well as the SOA, as independent entities. The SOA is going to be directly impacted by the information that is within those other documents. And those other documents, it'll be sort of a back and forth. If something changes, if you've identified through writing your CPR that there's a new clinical relevance for your particular IVD, that needs to then get added to the SOA. So there is a lot of back and forth that occurs as you're developing your SOA. So being organized and having those feeder documents, that SVR, APR, and CPR, really well done and well organized and finalized, will help you significantly as you're writing the SOA. It's sort of like writing the conclusion or sort of the intro and conclusion of a paper. You're going to revisit it if you go in and you realize that the data is not really saying what you introduced, or if you fail to actually prove something, you may need to revise it, or you may need to go back to that and figure out why you didn't prove that in the first place. So it definitely is a process. And I think that's sort of the key takeaway, is that to treat this as a writing process that can be replicated easily. So if you do need to do a gap search, or if you are identifying a new safety or performance objective late in the game, that's going to require a new systematic literature review and identification of new articles that will be relevant to those particular safety and performance guidelines. So the more of these feeder documents and supporting documents that you can have going into it, the better, because this SOA will be how you tie them all together.
Okay, and our next question up on the screen is, the PEP is also required to present the state of the art. This is prior to planning searches for SVR, et cetera. Do you include a less systematic version and then update in PER after doing the systematic searches?
Yes, we typically will write, because we're writing the SOA as a standalone document, in our experience with MDR, it will then get imported and moved into the CEP and the CER in that instance. So I would expect it will be the same type of process that will be undertaken with IVDR. I don't anticipate that being much different. So I would plan on writing it as a standalone document as part of your PER, and then being prepared to actually have it consistent between the two documents.
Okay. I'll move right along to the next question. We still have a couple of minutes left, so I wanted to encourage our attendees to please keep sending us your questions. We did carve out time specifically to be able to address your questions. And thank you for all the really great questions so far. So the next question, if you can see my screen, are systematic review filters permissible to narrow PubMed searches?
You can use that, but again, I sort of like refer you back to sort of the inherent issues with PubMed. You may get a lot of off-target hits with those systematic review filters, and you may miss a lot of sort of critical articles if you're just limited to a PubMed search. So having something like ProQuest or the Dialogue, those types of more advanced search platforms that can search across multiple databases will significantly impact like the amount of time it's going to take you to screen through all of these articles, and also ensure that it's methodologically sound. You don't want to go into it and it feel like you were sort of searching for, you want your search to be targeted, but you want it to also, you would anticipate you would get some off-target hits. If your search is too precise, that almost can be worrisome that, you know, you've cast your net way too small, that you haven't really done a full search of the literature as a whole.
Okay. I wanted to ask this question. It seems like an important one. Somebody asked, what is MedDev Ref 4?
Oh yeah, so this is going to be one of our feeder documents that we use in the CER world. So for MDR, which is the medical device regulations, MedDev Rev 4 is basically some of the guidelines and the recommendations that we use for really understanding the critical components for writing a CER. And the IVDR regulations actually reference and sort of refer people back to MedDev Rev 4. So I can try to locate that, but if you search for that, it's fairly easy to find online. It's a very common reference document, which is why we use that as our reference point all the time. Most of us have it bookmarked and refer to it regularly.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Our next question, we have a standalone software product. How can we best approach the PER elements that do not apply to our product?
Yes, this question I think came in from one of the panelists, like before the actual webinar. So I'm posting a link here to this IMDRF website. They actually, it's the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. They're basically a group of volunteers who publish guidelines. They're not binding, but they're designed to provide assistance. And they have a whole series of articles that are designed to sort of describe what the specific guidelines are relative to software for medical devices, or in this case, software, any standalone software products. It seems like in terms of sort of how to approach this, it really will depend on your particular product, but the general idea is that if you have a software product, you still need to show that there's a valid clinical association between the output that your software generates and the targeted condition that your software is designed to assist with diagnosing. And then you have to show how, if there are any glitches with your particular software product in terms of accuracy or reliability or its ability to provide output data. And then also looking at whether or not it's actually serving its intended purpose in a target population. Like, how does it actually work in clinical settings? Is this something that's used in a hospital setting, or is this like a take-home product? If you have a software that's designed, for instance, to monitor blood sugar, you could actually be testing your blood sugar at home, or you could be testing it in the field. how does that blood sugar test, how accurate is it? How does the software, basically what are the checks and balances and the safety information designed to assist you with actually ensuring that your software is giving you an accurate reflection of your current clinical, your outcomes that you're testing. So there are very specific guidelines that for, software is going to be a tricky one. And I think this is going to fall into a lot of the different IVD, everyone in the IVD is going to sort of have to come up with their own strategy and approach based on the specifics and the unique circumstances. I think some are going to fit more readily, and some are going to require a little bit more sort of planning and thought to really figure out how to address each of these different issues. But that's a big part where having that multidisciplinary writing team involved, where you have people who are there to help really understand the scientific validity and the analytical testing and the performance. But then you also want people who are there and know how to write this information and synthesize this information. Most of the IVDs have not been subjected to notified body scrutiny. So just having a true understanding of sort of what the requirements are and making sure that you're casting a wide net and you're covering all of your bases through having these very well-defined systematic literature reviews. That will really inform you as to sort of what to cover within the SOA and within each of the different feeder documents.
Thanks, Sarah. We have just a few more minutes, so I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question. While writing the state of the art, only the subject, device, and scope to be taken care of, or any article that talks about the device in general. So an ELISA commonly used and also company manufactured ELISA, both are used to diagnose a particular infection. So I guess the question is, should they be only taking papers belonging to the company device?
No, and that's really where I think we're going to have a lot of the questions that are going to arise is who are your comparators and who are your alternatives? So other companies, ELISA devices will still need to be within the scope and be addressed within the SOA. You're going to be focusing on how your particular device performs, so how your ELISA performs relative to the other alternatives. But if other companies have put out an ELISA that's targeted against the same exact molecular target, or if they have differences in their approach, their sensitivity, their specificity, those are things you're going to want to make sure that you cover as part of your landscape analysis, just to sort of address how your approaches are similar and how they're different and how that may impact their clinical utility. But you'll also want to explain, if there are other tests, if there are RT-PCR based approaches to testing for the same analyte, that's something that you can use as an alternative testing. You don't have to go into nearly as much detail in terms of the alternatives. You can say sort of what their general pros and cons are, but you really do want to address sort of how some of these your most similar comparators, how do you compare to them in the clinical landscape?
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to throw just one more question at you before we close out. Regarding the use of databases for systematic review, can we understand that PubMed is also acceptable for the systematic review, right?
I would say, if it were me, I would not rely solely on PubMed. I've seen many, many instances in the CER writing world where a simple PubMed search will give you thousands upon thousands of hits and not actually find the relevant articles that will get pulled down by a ProQuest. So having that proper search set up from the get-go and done correctly is going to save you so much time in the end. I've had some PubMed searches that will retrieve tens of thousands of articles, and no matter what you do to refine your search, you're still getting a lot of really off-target hits, and you will know that there's a really good article out there and you're not pulling it down through that search. So in my experience, relying on PubMed alone is just a really tricky spot to be in, and it winds up taking a lot more time in the long run.
Thanks, Sarah. We are out of time, but I did want to thank you for just answering all these amazing questions people have had. I know we have a few more that we didn't get to, so we'll definitely be reaching out to you after the webinar. If you enjoyed this webinar, you may also want to check out our previous one. You mentioned this earlier in your presentation. It's called A Practical Guide Conducting Systematic Literature Reviews in Support of IVDR Readiness. If you have any more questions on our content today or would like to learn about our services, you can still get your free appointment with us. Our contact information is consult@criterionedge.com. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us and all your wonderful questions. Please stay safe and take care.